Of the 186 states on the planet, the last 11 on the list are in Africa. Every second inhabitant of the Sahara region living in these states lives below the poverty line. Africa is also where 90% of all malaria deaths in the world occur. The poverty of Africa characterizes it as the poorest continent on the planet. However, why this happens, there is no clear answer. History and hypotheses can help to understand the causes of this continent's problems. Most of the videos on this topic talk about the colonization of Africa, in which the Europeans allegedly plundered and abandoned the continent. However, in practice, in Africa, they did not encounter lizards wielding laser weapons, and were not forced out of their territory after drinking water from Lake Baikal. In 1597, Portugal captured Angola, where the troops encountered resistance from local warriors who had been in development for the past 3 years. If one of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire, who lived 1.5 millennia ago, had access to teleportation devices, then Africa could be invaded even with the use of Roman technology. Thus, we can conclude that the continent was already lagging behind at the time of the beginning of colonization, and the reason for this should be sought in an earlier period. The historian John Maurice offers an interesting version, according to which you need to go back in time not for several centuries, but for hundreds of thousands of years ago. Approximately 2 million years ago in Africa, there was a firmware update for the genus Homo, and a species called Homo erectus or Homo erectus appeared. This species was more like us than apes, could make fire, use tools, and may have had primitive speech. The renewal that happened with Homo erectus proved to be extremely successful, and they spread throughout Africa and even reached Indonesia. Then began the important process of adaptation. Asia had less food than Africa, it was colder in Europe, and the climate in Indonesia is very different. Homo erectus began to adapt to new conditions, and Homo heidelbergensis, Sinanthropes, Denisovans, and others appeared. They had descendants, and one of those descendants was the Neanderthals. However, African Homo erectus, you ask, have remained virtually unchanged. Their species did not require changes in conditions, and no species of Homo survived to modern times, with the exception of Neanderthals, who, according to some sources, disappeared about 30,000 years ago. The family tree of the Homo clan is a complex structure with many subtleties, but for our understanding it is important to learn one logical fact. People adapt to new conditions. Neanderthals, finding themselves in new environments, were significantly more developed than their ancestors, Homo erectus, who remained in Africa. It's not about personal preference, it's just that the invisible hand of evolution is at work. Continuing our journey, we move on to the second stage. Somewhere around 200,000 years ago, for reasons completely unknown to anthropologists, Homo sapiens appeared in Africa. The laws of the market also worked here, and the new firmware turned out to be much more advanced than the previous ones. Scientists do not even exclude the option of returning one of the scattered tribes of Homo erectus to a forgotten homeland in the process of adaptation that stimulated evolution. One way or another, at this time, Africa again became the most advanced place on the planet. European Neanderthals, with their premium version of Homo sapiens, could not compete with this development. Then the wheel of samsara took another key turn as the first Homo sapiens began their migration out of Africa again, spreading across the globe. This time people were the owners of a more developed brain, which became their decisive advantage. Instead of waiting millennia for evolution to change their physiology, modern man has taken matters into his own hands. He began to change his culture to new conditions, hunt mammoths, sew clothes, and so on. The big brain proved useful for all the tribes that remained in Africa. They were also perfected about 15,000 years ago. At this time, the rarest moment of calm and communism came on the planet, when everyone was equal. However, progress has not been equally tangible in different parts of the world. Then someone came up with the idea to domesticate a cow and grow millet, which led to the start of the agricultural revolution. This allowed people to build huge cities, develop science, and create empires. However, the revolution was accompanied by some nuances. To understand these nuances, it is enough to move to Norilsk for a while and sadly observe how a double crop is harvested in the Kuban, while 0 degrees are outside the window in June. In other words, climate played an important role when the first civilizations appeared. If you look at the map of the location of these civilizations, suspicions will be confirmed. The valleys of the rivers Indus and Ganges in Mesopotamia are very well located in terms of climate. Historians have the concept of 2 happy latitudes, denoting 2 zones of the earth, where there were ideal conditions for agriculture and animal breeding. In fact, these lines can be stretched to Mexico and Peru, where the process also began around the same time. At this point, the inhabitants of Africa, with the exception of the Nile Valley in ancient Egypt, faced difficulties in growing food and raising animals in the rest of the continent. This was due to the limited and isolated territories that were available for research and use. According to John Maurice, the first separation of Africa from the rest of the world took place here. In the Middle Ages, it took about several thousand years for ancient societies to go from the first wheat fields to full-fledged residential settlements, and several thousand more years to turn the settlements into cities. And at the final stage, which took the same amount of time, it was necessary to turn into huge empires and, perhaps, even invent anime. Due to the climate and limited resources, the second stage of development in Africa took twice as long. When the continent reached the stage of the creation of the first states, the ancient Egyptians, states in the Middle East and Europe already appeared. However, inland Africa, in this example, remained backward because its resources were poorer and geographically farther from the developed regions. This is confirmed by Egypt, which, thanks to the Nile River and the presence of steel, developed actively, while in the Mediterranean Mesopotamia for thousands of years life flourished and full-fledged states existed. The appearance of the internal states of Africa occurred only at the beginning of our era, such as the Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of the Congo, and other empires, which were already far behind at the time of their birth. So, at that time, already ancient Egypt made campaigns in Nubia, Constantinople, and Persia, and also competed for Ethiopia. We should not forget about Rome, but it is better to say that there were strong and powerful states in Africa. The Mali Empire surprised with its wealth, and its ruler Mansa Musa is considered one of the richest people in history. The Songhai Empire was primarily a resource state, but also developed trade, and the coins of the Aksumite Kingdom were used even at the height of the Roman Empire. Abyssinia, later known as Ethiopia, fought successfully even against the Ottoman Empire. Surely you have heard about the military campaigns of Italy in Ethiopia. In general, we can say that even under the conditions of wild nature, which were present both in the civilizations of Europe and in Mesopotamia, Africa tried to gain strength and develop. It just happened that the development of Africa seemed too slow. But this is not a unique situation in the history of the planet. This has happened in many other regions. The clearest and most famous example are the Mayan and Aztec civilizations, which, due to geographical and cultural characteristics, developed separately from the Old World. By the time of colonization by the conquistadors, Central and South America resembled the early era of Rome in Europe. However, the difference lies in the fact that the Europeans actively assimilated the Indians and other peoples, while in Africa history developed quite differently. Despite the rapid process of colonization, by 1870 European states controlled only 10% of the continent, mainly coastal areas. The remaining 90% of Africa continued to develop and enjoyed the benefits brought to them by the accidental geographical separation of Homo sapiens. Europe reached Africa later, by 1914 already controlling 90% of the continent, but this control was conditional. Unlike South America, European colonizers did not plan to populate and assimilate African territories. Thus, the natural backwardness of Africa was intensified by the horrors of colonial rule. This, of course, is only one of the theories, and the reasons for the backwardness of the African continent can be sought in other factors. However, it is safe to say that the reason is not related to race, eye or hair color, and other attributes that were favorite topics of Austrian artists. There are white-skinned Aztecs, red-skinned Indians, Asians, and other species of Homo sapiens in history who have failed in the geographical, social, and cultural lottery, but often through no fault of their own. It is physically impossible to expect similar achievements in agriculture from the Aleuts living in the far north, as from the Babylonians, whose food grew everywhere. Problems such as dictators, corruption, problems with medicine, and other attributes of modern Africa that slow down its development are a different story. The reality is not as cinematic, and most historians are inclined to believe that if Africa were fenced off by a wall, in 1,000 years it would be practically the same as the Western world. At present, she simply received her gift from the invisible hand of the market, while other regions of the planet did not have this.